I miss the old, straight from the gold. Chop up the soul, set on his goals. I hate the new, the bad mood, the always rude, spaz in the news.
It's hard to deny the position Five Nights at Freddy's holds in the genre of indie horror. It was certainly the first of its kind back in the day and practically created the mascot horror genre, for better or worse. It's also a little hard to deny that Five Nights at Freddy's has changed over the years, both in a thematic sense and, well, everything else. I'd like to preface this video with the fact that what I'm about to yap about are just my opinions on a silly game about robot furries trying to kill you. If you are someone who genuinely enjoys modern Five Nights at Freddy's and the direction the franchise is going in, more power to you. I know that's a very nerd emoji point that I've seen a lot of people give, but it is genuinely something worth keeping in mind. Don't let my video discredit your enjoyment of things. At all. I'm just some random bozo on the internet. I think it all depends what you want from the game, honestly. The things I'll be talking about in this video come from the perspective of someone who got into Five Nights at Freddy's for the horror. So just keep that in mind. The worth of an experience, such as a video game, is relative in two main ways. There's the subjective aspect, also known as the court of public opinion, built up by those who have experienced the game for themselves. And then there's the loosely objective aspect, which is the comparison of a game to every other game, particularly ones featured in the same franchise or genre. In this case, I will be judging the modern state of Five Nights at Freddy's completely relative to what Five Nights at Freddy's used to be. As you probably rightly assumed, I quite prefer the old Five Nights at Freddy's games. Why, I hear you ask? It's simple. They were scarier. But, of course, just saying the original games were scarier is a pretty basic statement to make. Well, that is, unless we break it down. We've all heard the story. Scott Cawthon makes some game about a beaver, some guy takes a dump on it, and Scott takes that criticism and decides to play to his strengths, making the hit video game Five Nights at Fredbear's. Freddy Fazbear. To say that Scott has a talent for making robot furries eerie and uncanny is an understatement in my opinion. While I do believe that some people have done a better job of remastering the original cast of characters in much more uncanny ways, primarily in the Five Nights at Freddy's analog horror things that people do, I do still think that his designs were pretty ahead of their time. Nevertheless, these guys have always given me the creeps, and pretty much every animatronic from the original Fnaf games looks absolutely stunning, and pretty dread-inducing at times, especially when they first came out and weren't memed to hell like they are now. The animatronics in the newer age of Five Nights at Freddy's just don't compare. I'm not saying that primarily from a design standpoint, because they're technically not poorly designed, but they're just not scary. At all. And unfortunately, as I explained at the beginning of this video, I'm looking at this from the aspect of horror, and I am comparing modern FNAF to old FNAF, which had a dark, dismal, and often depressing art style that really complemented the themes of kids getting brutally murdered and having their corpses stuffed into gears and cogs and sharp metal pieces. I find it interesting that Scott never actually showed any humans in his games. Well, apart from the 8-bit minigame sections. It's pretty obvious that Scott figured he wouldn't be able to design humans properly in his 3D art style, and his restraint was a really smart move. Seeing a 3D human in a grounded game like FNAF would probably just take anyone out of the experience. Hey, at least Security Breach does it. She looks like a Fortnite character. I hate it. To give some benefit of the doubt, the characters we see in the Ruin DLC of Security Breach are much more eerie than the original Security Breach cast. It's definitely still missing the subtlety of the original Five Nights at Freddy's games, but it's pretty damn good considering the original design Steel Will had to alter and expand upon. Whoa, that was pretty spooky. Obviously, you weren't actually as immersed as you would be playing the games, because this is just footage of someone else playing the games, but I'm sure you understand roughly the point I'm trying to make. Which is, of course, dark abandoned places are scary. Wait, I mean, atmosphere. Yeah, atmosphere. It's something that makes or breaks a game, or any other piece of media for that matter. Now, let's compare those clips I showed you to this.
I should get back to the stage right away.
One is relatively eerie and foreboding, the other isn't. Now, again, I am going to give the benefit of the doubt here and point out that the atmosphere of the Ruin DLC is much, much better than what we got in Security Breach. Not as good as the original Five Nights at Freddy's games in my opinion, but I'll be getting to that in a moment. Now, a good question to ask would be, what is atmosphere? Put simply, it's the general tone of something. Not a very straightforward concept, I know, but dumbed down, it's a culmination of everything the game has to offer. The environment, the characters, the lighting, the way the world interacts with itself, the way the characters interact with the world. The spaces in the original Five Nights at Freddy's games felt big, but small in an almost nostalgic way. They played on that childhood nostalgia of small, indie play places, but twisted them into something dark and disturbing. The lighting here was grim and shoddy. The characters that roamed the halls also played on that nostalgia of mascots meant to appeal to children. As a kid, you might have remembered them being cheerier than they actually are. Less dead. These animatronics are lifeless husks of metal, unfeeling and uncaring, like a force of nature, devoid of any reasoning. They're not meant to be moving around like this, but they are. Something that's meant to be dead is acting like it's alive, and I feel like that crosses into some sort of internal uncanny valley for us as people. I would cover sound design too, but I'm lazy, and there is a really good video by a channel called Scruffy that covers the sound design of Five Nights at Freddy's to a capacity I just can't. Let's compare that to Security Breach. Enormous rooms, barely a dark spot, the lights are bright and unending, even though this is meant to be after hours. It doesn't really feel realistic or grounded at all. It's all too big, too flashy, too alive. And that's not only a point to make about the environment, the animatronics here feel alive too. From Glamrock Freddy to Roxy, they all have emotions for some reason. It's almost like the writers tried to make them sympathetic, not in a deep and depressing way like Am from I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, but on a very basic, bare-bones level. There are parts of the Mega Pizzaplex that start to emanate the atmosphere of the original games. Ironically enough, mostly in an area meant to be the aftermath of Pizzaria Simulator, which is pretty neat and... What is that? Why is that here? It looks so utterly out of place. Anyways, the atmosphere of the Ruin DLC of Security Breach is much better. Miles better, even. Unfortunately, for me personally, the heavy sci-fi aspects of Ruin completely throw me off. I understand it makes for interesting game design, but it really doesn't complement the kind of atmosphere they were going for. That is a general issue of Security Breach, however, and I understand that it's meant to be set in the distant future, but the points I've made still stand, whether or not they make sense in the lore. That being said, Sister Location was one of the original Five Nights at Freddy's games, and it was much more sci-fi in nature. I'd argue Scott still managed to keep the atmosphere eerie despite that fact though. The sci-fi aspects he added were still very grounded and believable in my opinion, which is why I don't think they broke the atmosphere. Honestly, I probably wouldn't mind the heavy inclusion of sci-fi if it was scary or eerie in nature. Take the show Black Mirror, for example. They take sci-fi concepts and use them to get under your skin. It is definitely something that's doable. There's this strange paradox in writing that appears from time to time. You could get a team of writers in the same room, yet they'd struggle to produce something that compares to a single dedicated writer working in his mother's basement. Obviously, this isn't always the case, but it sometimes is. Steel Wool Studios probably have more money than Scott Cawthon ever did when he was making the first few Five Nights at Freddy's games, and they definitely have more writers and designers than he did. Because, well, he didn't really have any. And yet, with everything I've said, I personally think that the original Five Nights at Freddy's games were much, much better than the stuff we got since Pizzaria Simulator. Don't even get me started on how buggy Security Breach was on launch, but that's a point other people have covered much better than I ever could, and a lot more than I ever could. Obviously, there are a lot of factors that play into these things, and I don't think there's a singular thing worth pinpointing here. But despite whatever happened behind the scenes, Security Breach, and by loose extension, modern Five Nights at Freddy's, does still fall into this paradox of writing and direction that I mentioned earlier. The first few Five Nights at Freddy's games, in my opinion, very clearly had a soul, purpose. Scott Cawthon wanted to tell a story, and he wanted to make the experience entertaining and challenging. These games were his passion, and it clearly shows. I feel like that soul is missing in modern Five Nights at Freddy's. Especially with Security Breach, Five Nights at Freddy's feels like it's continuing not because there's a story Steel Wool Studios were truly passionate about and wanted to tell, but rather because Five Nights at Freddy's was a massive IP and was making a lot of money. I've seen some people say that Five Nights at Freddy's should have ended with Pizzaria Simulator. And, well, as brutal as it sounds, I'd have to agree. It wrapped up just about everything and gave a pretty satisfying conclusion to it all. Obviously, I'm not accounting for Ultimate Custom Night here, because that game was also very incredible. Pizzaria Simulator is just the point at which the Five Nights at Freddy's fandom basically agrees that the narrative was wrapped up completely. I will say, however, that I could always be proven wrong on this point. Five Nights at Freddy's is not over, even if some people think it should be. The new upcoming game, The Secret of the Mimic, could fix every point I mentioned in this video, and I personally hope it does. Oh yeah, Enter the Pit was pretty cool. It was kinda scary, especially those scenes with the kids in the sprint locks. That was pretty dark and I loved it. But hey, I think it was a pretty good game. I'll also quickly say that I really liked Help Wanted, but a great deal of that game were just recreations of the original Five Nights at Freddy's games in VR, so I'm not too sure if that counts. With all that being said, I miss the old Five Nights at Freddy's. Yes, yeah, I said it. I said the title of the video. Roll credits. In all seriousness though, Five Nights at Freddy's was a massive part of my childhood, and I wouldn't have gotten into it if not for its creepy and interesting nature. You could almost tell there's something hidden beneath the surface to it all. I understand there's a point to be made that sometimes game franchises just need to evolve and change. Change is the nature of all things, after all, and I don't even necessarily have some sort of deep-rooted problem with the newer Five Nights at Freddy's games that have come out. It is just as simple as, I miss the old Five Nights at Freddy's. And, well, I've fully explained why. There are things like Five Nights at Freddy's VHS tapes, or analog horror, whatever you'd like to call it, and Five Nights at Freddy's Plus, forever unreleased, that really tried channeling that feeling and essence of the old Five Nights at Freddy's. Judging by the numbers, there are people out there who want this type of content. Perhaps the new Five Nights at Freddy's is trying to market more to kids, hence the reason it's changed. But I do genuinely miss that time when Scott was just making games because he enjoyed it, not having to worry if it was marketable or not. Perhaps that's just the consequence of having a piece of media blow up and not being able to keep up with producing it. I suppose the saying is true. You either die a hero, or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. I think it went like that. Something like that. If you've made it to this part of the video, consider liking the video. Or subscribing. It'd be nice. It's a mild-mannered request, not a demand. Obviously, the opinions I've expressed in this video are my opinions, and they are regarding a silly game about robot furries hunting you down in a pizza place. If you really disagree with my opinions, feel free to hop over to my Twitch to tell me how much you disagree with them. I'll definitely listen. Also, I'm not perfect. If I get a piece of information wrong in this video, I'm preemptively retracting those statements, and I'll be probably readjusting my opinions a little bit. Now, if you've made it to this part of the video, you're probably someone who already watches my content. Usually I make stupid Minecraft lore and upload Minecraft clips from my Twitch here, so seeing a Five Nights at Freddy's video might be a little bit of a surprise. Admittedly, it's not like I've never talked about FNAF before. I have. I decided to make a video like this because it's something I like, and I haven't really seen anyone cover this particular topic before. Or at least I haven't seen anyone bring up the points I have. If there is a video out there, somewhere, that covers the points I have, I'm sorry. I must have missed it. I will also say, Five Nights at Freddy's videos do pretty well from what I've seen. That's not the main reason I made this video, but it is a reason. The chances of me becoming a channel that covers Five Nights at Freddy's or anything like that is pretty low. While I do quite like watching Five Nights at Freddy's videos, both new and old, I don't really think making them is something I personally want to do. I also kind of wanted to give a shot at a more scripted video like this, and see how it does, and see if people like it. I like talking about things, and apparently people like my voice, so why not give it a shot? Okay, that's it. You can go home now. The video's over.